Hello, all of my history-loving friends. Welcome back to the world of Madame Morbid. This is a history channel. I talk about any number of historical topics, many of which have a darker aspect to them. If you like what you see, please subscribe to my channel and like the video. Today we are going to be talking about Pearl White. I've already done 3 episodes about Pearl. The first episode covered her childhood in Greenridge, Missouri. The second episode followed her teenage years in Springfield, Missouri. And our third episode followed the beginning of her acting career while she was on the road, moving from stock company to stock company. Today's episode is going to cover her rise to stardom, her career in the movies, and we will kind of wrap up her life. There will be one more episode after this one that specifically covers her last visit to Missouri in 1927. Where we left off last time, Pearl had headed to New York City on the advice of a fellow actor who told her that life on the road was a dead end, that she should try New York City and try Broadway. She arrives in New York with a list of producers and agents and people that she should talk to try to get a job on Broadway. Pearl spent a couple of days going to plays on Broadway, and she said she would have given anything to be on Broadway, and she didn't care how tiny the role might be. Even though she had always played the lead in these stock companies, she was okay not doing that here. But she just could not get a job. She said she went in, she saw some of the really most powerful producers on Broadway at the time, including Charles Frohman, and she said she just got nowhere. So she, again, joined a stock company. This one was performing for a month in Asbury Park, and it also was going to be performing for 5 months in Norwalk, Connecticut. But she said as January came in, her voice was really in trouble. She thought from maybe doing these melodramas, maybe she was doing a lot of screaming and crying, I don't know, but she had strained it and it needed a break. Some woman who had performed in moving pictures before had joined their company, and she told Pearl, why don't you go to these movie companies and see if you can do some work there and give your voice time to recover, give it a rest. Pearl said movies had no interest for her at all at the time, but it was a good option while her voice recovered. So she got a list of all of these movie companies from this woman, and she headed to New York City. She gave notice to the company, and she began looking for an acting job in the movies. The first place she wanted to check out was Edison. But she went the wrong way, and she ended up on the total opposite side of town looking for Edison, and it wasn't there. So she ended up going to another studio. The second movie company she went to met with Theodore Wharton. He would later direct her in some of her later movies, but at this time, all he sees in front of him is a farm girl who has no business being in New York. She says he asked her where she came from, and she said that she had been performing in Norwalk, Connecticut, but she said her voice was so bad when she met with him that he didn't believe her. She said, I just let him rave on as he told me to go back home to my folks. The movie business is too tough. I'll never make it. She said, I had probably seen more horrible things in show business than he had ever suffered through. Pearl got her first acting job in a movie for the Powers Company. Director Arthur Golden took her seriously and gave her a part in a movie. At that time, they were only making 1 reels, and she said it took 3 weeks for her to see the first image of her in a movie. And she was horrified by how she looked and was ready to just leave the business. I can't stand, look how horrible I look. But they took her in and they changed how she dressed. Dark hair did not film well, so she got the dye out of her hair, which took a while. She started dressing more simply. She stopped doing the huge pompadour piling all of her hair on top of her head. She stopped doing that, and she said it started to do better. She worked for them for a few months, and then she moved on to the Lubin Company, which was in Philadelphia. She said the stars of the Lubin Company were Florence Lawrence and Arthur Johnson, and they may be considered the first movie stars ever. Florence Lawrence did not like Pearl, or she was jealous of Pearl, or maybe she considered her a professional threat. So she refused to work with Pearl, which unfortunately for Miss Lawrence backfired in that they moved Pearl to other projects. She was only supposed to be a secondary character, but they started giving her leading roles in her own pictures. She did that for a few months, but decided to return back to New York, where she got on with the Pathé Company. Pathé was located in New Jersey. She comes in and asks to speak with the casting director, and out walks Theodore Wharton, who several months before had advised her to pack it up and go home, that this was not the place for her. And by the way, she had planned on, as soon as her voice got better, going back to the stage. But she was making so much better money in the movies that she never returned to the stage again. And she said, once my voice got better, I started using it to talk myself into better parts, better companies, better pay. She walks into Pathé, and this time Wharton is much more open. And he says, I think you're just what we need. So he takes her in to meet Louis Gasnier, who was the head of Pathé, and Louis Gasnier would, in future months, be her director for many films. She said she stood before him, and he was having her take her hat off, take her hair down, turn right, turn left, make different faces, turn in a circle so I can see all of your attributes. And he spoke no English. So as he's talking about her with his associates, she has no idea what they're saying about her. And when he is her director, she mostly did melodramas for Pathé. But eventually she was offered another job making a lot more money for another company that made comedies. She said she was the major pie slinger for the Crystal slapstick comedies for a while. And this is when she starts to get fan mail. She said in her stage career, she had gotten maybe a handful of letters from fans. By 1919, she was getting as many as 10,000 letters from fans every month. And the letters came from around the world. When she was a child, I think when her brother was about 12 years old, Fred had been her constant companion and best friend in her childhood. And he had run away from home when they were living in Springfield. She said one night he just told her goodbye and he left, and she didn't see him again for years. He came back once to tell her that he had joined the Navy. Around this time, she gets a letter from a sailor who had seen her in a movie. He signed his letters F.L. White, and he said he was serving on the battleship Huntington. She thought it was interesting because her brother's name was Fred, but his middle initial was E. And so she wasn't sure. That's one thing that made her wonder if it really was her brother. Eventually, he did reveal his name was Fred. So she was exchanging letters with this man in the spring of 1917, which is a couple of years before she was writing her book. And they corresponded for a good year, maybe two. She started to get suspicious because he was telling stories about he had a sister in Missouri that he hadn't seen for years. And she started to wonder if he was her brother. And finally she broke it to him that I think you're my brother, Fred. And she stopped hearing from him for a while. Maybe this scared him, or she didn't know. But some months later, she got a letter telling her that he had accidentally shot himself and been killed during an operation. and she thought he was dead. But some years later, and I'm going to do an episode all about her last visit to Missouri in 1927. She was surprised to be met in Greenridge at the train station by her brother Fred, who had not died. I don't know why she was told that he was dead, but she was reunited with him years later. By 1913, she said she had saved up $6,000, which was an absolute fortune to her. And she decided to take some time off and spend several months in Europe. She spent time in France and Italy and England. And when her money ran out, she went back home. Serials were a pretty new invention at this time to the movie world. They began making them in New Jersey. And as Pearl returned to the United States, she got word from the Pathé studio that Louis Gosnier wanted to offer her a part in a serial they were going to produce called The Perils of Pauline. She would, of course, play Pauline, and in every episode, a horrible villain who wanted her inheritance money would try to do her in. In these movies, she is playing Pauline, of course, and she is the adoptive daughter of a very wealthy man who also has a son. So they're not related, and she is going to marry this other man who was raised with her, but is not her brother. And her father obviously dies in the first episode. He starts showing signs of illness, and he tells Pauline that she will get her inheritance when she marries Harry. And she says, "Oh, Father, I don't want to marry yet. I want to enjoy and have adventures my life before I settle down and get married." But it's written into the will that as soon as she marries Harry, she gets the money. In the meantime, his secretary, who is actually a villain and a con man, but he's managed to get his way into the will. So if anything were to happen to Pauline, he gets the money, and he has the control over the money until she marries. She absolutely cannot marry Harry. So in every episode, this villain with an accomplice tries to kill Pauline. The studio really talked about, oh, Pearl does all of her stunts. And I know that she did some of them, absolutely. But she also had stuntmen. And at one point, the lie of the studio started to come out when one of her stuntmen died doing a stunt for one of her movies. That is when people knew she's not doing all of her stunts. I feel like, and this is just an instinct I have, that she probably started out doing the vast majority of her stunts in the beginning. She was getting injured. And toward the end of her career, those injuries were really adding up and incapacitating her ability to continue to do them herself. And in the end, I think her injuries got so bad that even being in movies anymore was tough on her physically, because there was so much damage done to her body over time. This is just an instinct I have, that the stuntmen probably became more necessary as her career progressed. Having been a trapeze artist, having performed in the circus, her body was in good shape to do stunts like this. She had no fear of anything. It's one of the things that made her successful in her career and that got her into so much trouble as a child. She was never afraid to try anything, to do dangerous things. Even in the first 3 episodes, there were all of these things she needed to learn how to do. She didn't know how to play tennis. She couldn't swim. And in the first 3 episodes, she's playing tennis. She is on a yacht that then explodes. Of course, she ends up in the water and she can't swim. And then there was another scene where she is supposed to be trapped in a runaway hot air balloon by herself, from which she then lowers an anchor that she catches on the side of a cliff or a tree or something like that. And then she climbs down the rope to the side of a cliff where she's hanging on and waiting for Harry to rescue her. She's reading this and she didn't know she wanted to do it. It sounded so dangerous, and she was having to sign this form that said if something horrible happened to her, she wouldn't sue the company, or the company wouldn't be, Pathé would not be responsible for what happened to her. But again, she couldn't say no, and it sounded really exciting, and she went ahead and did it. I don't know if the Perils of Pauline specifically is credited with the cliffhanger, or if it was just serial movies of the day in general. But a lot of times episodes would end with her in some horrible situation, and you had to come back for the next episode to see if she lived, which of course she always did. The term cliffhanger wasn't used until years after this, but it seems to have been born and come from serial movies like this. Love about Pearl White and her work in the movies was that Perils of Pauline came out in 1914. And she was doing things that weren't considered proper for a woman to do. In Perils of Pauline, often she rescued herself. Sometimes the man helps her, but she's not just passively sitting there and waiting for him to do it. Like that balloon scene. She uses her wits to figure out how to stop that balloon moving. She crawls down that rope, which would require enormous courage. And women are watching this. They're watching Pearl use a gun. They're watching Pearl be proactive and help and save herself. And it kind of normalizes women seeing them not relying solely on a man for everything, which society had obviously been set up in which they had to rely on a man, really. But Pearl's movies showed them that there's nothing weird about you doing the things that men do. Pearl came to be called Pathé's peerless, fearless girl for all of the stunt work that she did, for the fact that she seemed to have no fear of doing these stunts, of putting herself in danger. She was very smart with her money. She seems to have invested it. Over her 10-year career or so, she made upwards of $2 million in 19 teens and 20s. You can imagine how much money that was. She made movies up until the early to mid 20s. The last movie I saw her making was probably around 1924, but she was having some issues with just being happy. I think she was dealing with pain from injuries, from previous injuries that had continued to bother her. She had had a series of misfortunes in her personal life. In 1917 or 1918, somewhere in there, she married a man named Walter McCutcheon. Now, McCutcheon was he was an actor too. His parents had been actors. He was extremely handsome. And when World War I came along, early in World War I, he went to Canada and joined the army with them and got involved before the United States even did. He was wounded severely during the war at the Somme. He is said to have had a metal plate in his skull. It is said that he was carrying shrapnel in his body still when he came home. And it seems that he probably had some very severe PTSD. They were married for several years, but eventually she did want a divorce. And I think there were some really sad things going on in her life at this time, because this is also around the time that you start to see things in the newspaper about her being unhappy about the money that she has made it as an actress not making her happy, that she just wants a break, that she wants a rest. And eventually, after she left and divorced him, Walter McCutcheon would commit suicide. And I'm sure that was very hard on her, number one, from losing him, and number two, of the thoughts that you might have when something happens like that. Could I have done something more to help him? And of course, we're talking about World War I. PTSD wasn't even a thing. They didn't know what it was. I mean, they called it shell shock, or they called it battle fatigue. They knew of it, but they had no idea how to help people who had it. And as her life moved on, she did a little bit of stage work. Even after her movie career was over, she had a home in New York. She had a home in Philadelphia, I believe. And she also spent a lot of her time living in Paris. And she was doing some stage work in Paris as well. Toward the end of her life, she gained quite a bit of weight, and she got to where, I can identify with that, but she got to where she didn't really want to be photographed anymore. Before we leave for the day, I'm going to tell you one story she told about the Perils of Pauline that is worth telling. It involves the scene with the balloon. She gets in the hot air balloon, and the way the scene goes is she has been lured into the balloon. The guy who wants to kill her, he's got a camera, and he says, I'm going to take a picture of you in this balloon. He talks her into getting into it, and then his accomplice, as he's fake taking her picture, his accomplice rides in on a horse and causes a big commotion. And so the men who are holding the balloon get startled and let go. And the balloon floats off. She says she didn't know that the balloon guy was actually in the balloon with her. She thought she had to do all of this by herself. And at a certain point, she was supposed to start bringing the balloon down after they filmed what they needed to. The balloon was in Palisade Park, is where they launched it from. A really famous New Jersey amusement park that was on the Jersey Shore for decades. But as the balloon rises, the winds shift, and instead of being sent the direction she's supposed to be so they can film their scene, she is sent out to sea. And she thinks she's in big trouble. She's sitting there, and all of a sudden this voice asks, can I come out now? And she said it scared the crap out of her. That's not the word she used, but she didn't know the man was there. And he came out. It was the man that owned the balloon. He said, well, I figured I needed to probably be here to get you down. He sees that the winds have shifted, and he says, oh man, well, this is a problem. But all they can really do is just kind of wait it out. They end up floating over New York. They encounter a storm. They can't get too low because they can't risk getting around the buildings. All they can do is go up. And she said she was getting drenched by this torrential rain. He could see the storm coming and that they were going to go into it. And she had to help him. They start getting rid of the ballast. So it's the bags of sand you always see tied around the basket. They let the sand go, and they let it go gradually because you don't want to just drop a bunch of sand on the people on the ground. You want it to dissipate as it falls. She made it sound like they ended up getting rid of all of the ballast, but this made it so they could go higher. And they had to go above that storm cloud and wait for the storm to be over. She was in this balloon for hours, and eventually they were able to finally bring the balloon down. But she said she was just, for a while there, they were just circling above New York City looking for a safe place to land. After drifting around in the balloon with her new friend for about 3 hours, they gradually began to go lower and lower, letting the gas out. They found an open space. She said people were running all underneath them, so excited. They'd been watching what was going on, and the crowd was waiting for them when they finally landed somewhere near Long Island in an open space. Pearl knew she was dying, and in 1938, she began preparing for her death. She got together her will, she got her affairs in order, she purchased a plot in the Passy Cemetery in Paris near her home, and she arranged for her own funeral. On August 3rd, 1938, she went into a coma and died the next day of a cirrhosis of the liver. She had been a heavy drinker and drug user, most likely self-medicating from chronic pain from a back injury or other injuries she suffered while making the Perils of Pauline. Her father outlived her. She left $73,000 to charity. She also gave money to all of her relatives. As I said, she was very smart with her money, and she was able to support herself the rest of her life on what she had made as a movie star without having to continue to work, which with the injuries she was living with and the pain she was living with, that was probably a very good thing for her. Unfortunately, there wasn't a good way to manage that kind of pain like there is today. And of course, even today, when you have chronic pain like that, it is easy for the medications to become a problem. Now, there was a film made about her life in 1947. It is really not accurate, but Betty Hutton played her in the movie, and it's worth checking out. But just know that there's very little reality in it, and it was highly fictionalized, and it really was never intended to be a really accurate biography of her. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you made it to the end, congratulations! I really appreciate you sticking with me and hearing out the whole story. So I will see you next time. I will do one more episode on Pearl White about her visit to Missouri when she came back and saw her family, placed a gravestone on her mother's grave, and did a benefit at a theater on the square. So we will talk about that next time. I will see you then.